I was trained as an artist. I went to school in Porto Alegre, which is in the south of Brazil. And I was an undergrad for 7 years, so it's a bit longer than the usual. It's usually 4 years. But I was a slow learner, and I tend to metabolize things slower. And so I was always a bit late in terms of my education. Then from there, that's when I started my interest in site specificity. And the first exhibition that I was part of was like 1 year after I graduated. And from then on, I started being called to work on site-specific projects. And I became sort of like a specialist on that, in that mode of working. But what happened is that I found that I was a bit too attached to that methodology without knowing where it had come from, without knowing about its history, without having a more critical eye on what site specificity could be, with those questions in mind and a bit exhausted from so much exhibiting, I looked for an MFA. So I looked for the university sort of like a critical withdrawal from the exhibition logic, and as a space to reflect critically on what I was doing. So I took an MFA to better understand what site specificity meant. And that took 3.5 years, my MFA, in São Paulo, in the University of São Paulo. And then from there, I was interested in the university also as a mode for making a living, so I decided to become a professor. And the PhD came sort of like as a way to also get the credentials to become a professor, because I felt that my work was not product oriented or object oriented, and I was never a good networker, I guess, to work with galleries. So I thought that the university could still give me some dignity and perhaps an ethical or a way of looking at art that somehow was more aligned with my ethics. And what ended up happening is that at university, and this was all like I graduated in 97, which was when universities were beginning to welcome artists for MFAs and PhDs. So this was like also a shift in perspective. Like, I have a sister who's an artist, and she was working in the 80s. It was a lot more object oriented, right? And I think as the university, as artists started joining the university and graduate programs, the idea of art as research was also born, and something that is more process oriented, and that also starts finding connections to other disciplines and areas and departments and thinkers. So I think I'm part of that generation that kind of moved from a more object-oriented art and exhibition-based to more research-based and closer to the academia, which is not a solution, I think, because the academia has its own contradictions, complexities, complications. So and I then I just went on like doing postdoctoral research, one in 2014 in Florianopolis after my PhD, right? When I was studying site specificity again, that is my main focus. Like this is my obsession in my career, it's site specificity. But then I was relating it to agroecology and agroforestry. And then finally my second postdoctoral research was done in London, in Liverpool, in England, as a way to also do research for the project that I presented at the Liverpool Biennial in 2021. So I have a very strong academic background, and I presently teach at the University of California, Santa Cruz in the art department. So yeah, that's pretty much me in terms of like where I came from and my education. So it started in Brazil mainly, but it then became more international with time. And nowadays I don't live in Brazil anymore. I live in the U.S. in Santa Cruz, California. So, yeah. So when I was in my MFA studying site specificity, a lot of the texts, a lot of the bibliography on site specificity was written in the English language. The term itself, site specific, is used without translation in Portuguese and in most countries, right? People just adopted that term as a synonym for something that is contemporary, or it gives a certain status also to speak it in English without translation. So what I did as an MFA student, I started translating those texts to better understand them, as I think translating is the most attentive way of reading a text, because you really go word by word, period by period, comma by comma. It's like a really strong way of reading a text, right? It's some people think about translation as strong reading, and also critical reading, because you're really breaking it down, you're really decomposing, you're really opening up the text. And in a way, I find that translation, it is a bit about digesting, because you get the original and you break it down, and then you bombard it with your enzymes and your digestive system, and then you create something anew out of the original, right? Like, I don't know, when you're eating an apple, for example, that you're really breaking it down to its minimal parts, and then you're creating energy out of that, right, to make something new. So I do like to see, or to make that analogy between translating and digestion and metabolism. So I became really interested not only in the texts that I was translating, but in the translating act itself. And it became also an object of research for me. I started translating and thinking about translation. And in my MFA then, I tried to translate the word site-specific to Portuguese, thinking about site-specific as an Anglophone that depends on a certain language and a certain context and a certain culture to build its meaning. And if you bring it somewhere else, you necessarily have to translate it. Otherwise, you're betraying the very idea of site specificity, which is context defines meaning, right? So it seemed very awkward that we would use the word site specific in Portuguese without translating, because it seemed like a contradiction. So, you know, I just got into these, like, enmeshed in these thoughts in my MFA and then my PhD again. And when was it? I think it was when I was participating in a committee of a student who was also interested in translating, and then I was, you know, just expressing my thoughts on translation. And in this committee, there was an editor of an important publisher in Brazil called Peter Paubert, who's also a philosopher, and he was looking for someone to translate Anat Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. And he invited me, like in that very moment, just like, oh, Jorgge, I like your perspective on translation. Would you like to translate this book? I had already bought the book. I had already, like, I had an interest in that author. I had read one of her texts called Unruly Edges, which I really like. So I said yes immediately. And I regretted so many times that I had said yes after that, because it took me 3 years to translate it. It was probably the most challenging thing I've ever done intellectually. And I did it with a friend. I invited a friend to do it with me, a friend from the social sciences called Yuji Rafael. So it was an amazing journey, but such a hard thing to do, because I had to learn about so many different disciplines that are not specifically related to the Matsutake mushroom, which is what this author is writing about from the perspective of anthropology, but just like about Japanese history, about economy, about biology, about all these communities that work with the Matsutake mushroom, and about how it has become, you know, a luxurious food that travels across continents. And so, yeah, it was an amazing trajectory. And when I wrote the introduction to the book, which is reflecting about my position as a translator, I understood that I could look at the role of the translator as similar to the role of the fungus, right, or of the mushroom, in a sense that it is somehow destabilizing the original, right, and somehow creating a mycelium network that will connect it to a different territory, to a different culture, to a different time. So that's when I came up with this image of the translator as fungi, right? Translators as fungi, who are also contributing to the diversity of thought through building networks with other countries and with other languages. It was right before the pandemic. I created a seminar that I wanted to get together all the translators of Anat Singh's book to explore this idea of the fungi, the translator as fungi. So I invited the person who translated it to Japanese. I was about to get in touch with the person who translated it to German. It was also translated to Spanish. So my idea, it was an event called Patchy Translation that was supposed to have happened in the Netherlands. And But it never happened because of COVID. We had Annette Singh was already in Belgium. She was going to come. No, wait. She was in the U.S. about to fly to Belgium, like 1 week before, 1 week after actually
The lockdown.
the lockdown. Yeah. And who knows? Maybe we can still do it sometime. Now that I'm remembering what it was about, I felt like trying to do it again. And that got me into the whole, world of fungi. And it was also, I think Annette Singh's book belongs to a moment in history when we are, as a society, looking into fungi in a different way, right? So I also started reading about other authors who are interested in decentralizing the human and looking at it through a multi-species approach, which connects me back to the idea of agroecology and agroforestry that I had studied in 2014. So that's how my interest in fungi emerged. So how are artists and scientists involved or can get involved in a joint venture to somehow create language and forms of representation or forms of understanding that will live up to the complexity of these impossible images, right? So I think I've always seen that to be the artist's role in the environmental debate, but from being closer to scientists now, I think there is a creative side to language and to research that scientists are also in the same quest, in the same journey that we are, in terms of trying to describe what we're seeing, right? Yeah, I think that's such a great question, because the very idea of universalism or of one common language, right, that would unite us all, could be considered very modern, right? In the sense of, I think science is very much based on a modernist approach to life. And I think as artists, we're constantly resisting, right, this appeal of modernism and defying it with creating a complexity that will not fit into the box. So I do see that as like a really like going in opposite directions. Sometimes I feel that that specific aspect is not being criticized by the scientists themselves, right? For instance, one way I think to question the idea of modernity is through ancestral knowledge, right, of the land, through an indigenous approach. We do not have any indigenous representatives in the project at the moment, right? We did have Seba, who left, unfortunately, who was an artist, but we don't have someone from an indigenous community or an indigenous background defending an idea or a perspective of reality that is not based on modernity, which is a synonym to Eurocentric, right? So we just visited a territory, Tierra del Fuego, that is completely embedded in the indigeneity, and we only barely touched upon that layer of the territory, right? We know about the names of the tribes that live there. We know about some of their habits. We saw some pictures. But we're not looking at their cosmology, right? Or their cosmogony. We didn't look at the way they see the world. And we didn't tap into those principles as a way to question the way we're living. It was kind of naturalized that, oh, first it was them and then we arrived and now things are the way they are, right? So yeah, so I don't know. It might be very superficial of me to draw that criticism, but it seems like I would love to see more criticism of the sciences in that sense, right? Of like just criticizing the very ground they stand on. But I love how fungi somehow, I think, helps us do that, right? Because I think even for them, like even for mycologists, and that is something that they have said, right? That sometimes mycologists do face a certain prejudice in the sciences because their object of research is not very obedient and doesn't really fit into the boxes that are given to them, right? So their own topic of research somehow questions the scientific methods that they are working with, which is an amazing thing, right? That you think that this million-year-old species is, or not species, kingdom, right, is somehow deconstructing the modernist approach to science. So maybe that's a better way to frame what I just said.